Abi Chen spent 4 years at Bain in the firm's Texas offices and obtained an MBA from Harvard Business School. Now, she works with management consultant as a case coach, prepping candidates for consulting interviews. In today's episode, she leads a candidate through a Bain-style case featuring a private equity fund looking to acquire a school bus manufacturer. Check out the video of the case as well as the exhibit or chart from the case at the link in this episode's show notes. What framework will our candidate come up with to solve this problem? Keep listening to find out. I really encourage you to have a pencil and paper and follow along the case to see if you can solve it. It's great free case practice. You can work with Abi via one-on-one coaching. She'd love to work with you. So grab an hour or two of case coaching or join our Black Belt program for a comprehensive case prep program that includes 8 hours of one-on-one coaching. Link in the show notes to check that out. All right, let's get into this live case led by Abi Chen.
Yeah, without further ado, let's just jump right in. Are you ready?
Yep, ready. Let's do it.
All right. Your client is a private equity fund considering the acquisition of Big Yellow Bus Co., one of the leading manufacturers of school buses in the United States. It is the number one player in the market by revenue, number two by volume. There are only 3 competitors in the market with relatively equal share, but Big Yellow Bus was the clear leader 5 years ago. The client has engaged Bain to help determine whether or not to proceed with the investment. How would you recommend the client to proceed?
Let me just wrap up my notes here.
Yep.
Okay, this sounds like an interesting case. Very happy to work with the client on it. As a start, let me just play back the situation to ensure that we're aligned on this. So essentially, our client is a PE firm, and they are thinking about whether to invest in Big Yellow Bus Co. And briefly, we understand that Big Yellow Bus Co. is a leading player in the US. They manufacture buses. They're number one by revenue, number two by volume. And there are 3 other competitors, all with equal market share in the US market. And that our client was, you mentioned, a clear leader 5 years ago.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So I think now that we're aligned on at least the case prompt, I'd like to just ask a few clarifying questions around the objective of our client, the PE firm, and also to understand a bit about the business model of Big Yellow Bus Co.
Sure.
Yeah. So for the PE firm, my understanding is they typically would invest or acquire companies, and they're typically looking to sell it after X years for a certain kind of threshold target profit. So in this specific case, I just want to understand if that is the objective of the client, and do we have any specific information on the target, return on investment that they're looking at?
Yeah, let's assume. So your assumption is right. Let's just assume that our client acts just like most of the PE firms, that they're looking to exit the market in about 3 to 5 years.
Okay, 3 to 5 years. And is there a specific ROI that they're looking at in terms of the investment, like 50%, 10%?
Right now, we don't have that information.
Okay, clear. All right. And then just moving over to the understanding the business of Big Yellow Bus Co. So you mentioned they manufacture school buses, right? And in terms of their revenue model, just understanding, so it sounds like, are they a B2B kind of company? They make the school buses and then they sell it to other businesses that would need school buses in the US.
Yeah, so let's assume they do both B2B and B2C. So they basically they would just sell their product either directly to their consumer or through another party.
I see. Okay, clear. And do we know if, in terms of the product, is there just one bus we're talking about, or do they have different types of product lines when we think about the buses?
For now, let's just assume it's just one primary product.
Okay, so one product for both the B2B and B2C kind of customers. Okay, very clear. Okay, and just a point of clarification, you mentioned about the market structure earlier. So can I understand there are 4 key players in the market? So like Big Yellow Bus and then 3 other competitors.
So we'll get to that information a bit later. But let's assume it's 3 competitors total, including Big Yellow
in
Bus.
total.
Mhm.
I see. Got it. Okay, and the last question is: is Big Yellow Bus in terms of its business kind of all over the US, or are they concentrated in certain regions of the US?
Let's assume it's all over the US.
All over the US. Okay, very clear. I think I have good enough baseline information and context about clients. So if it's okay with you, let me just take a moment to structure an approach in which we can use to answer the question. All right.
Yep, sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to take a 30-second break to bring you this message. There's only one true way to build consulting skills, and that's to work on a consulting project, right? It makes sense. If you need to add experience to your resume or just want to see if consulting is right for you, then we'd love for you to join Strategy Sprint. Strategy Sprint, it's a 1-week virtual consulting project taking place in November of 2023. You will work in a team of 6, you'll get mentorship from an MBB consultant, and you're going to solve a strategic problem for a real-world client. As of the time of this recording, there are just 7 spots left for this program. So act fast before we sell out, because we sell out for every single program. Link in the show notes to learn more about Strategy Sprint. Okay, let's get back to this episode.
All right. Thank you for your time. So I think that the P firm should invest and acquire Big Yellow Bus company if 4 key conditions can be met. First, the market for such school buses has to be an attractive market for us to consider. Second, the PE firm should be able to achieve its return on investment through the acquisition of this Big Yellow Bus company, given that its primary objective as a PE firm is to make money and exit with a certain ROI. Third, our client should also have the necessary capabilities to make this acquisition, not just financially, but also operationally in terms of being able to run the company or able to find the necessary expertise to run a bus company. And fourth, our client should be able to also manage the kind of risk that may be associated with the operation of a bus company. Such risk could include business risk, operational risk, and even regulatory risk. And happy to go into the details later. But of these 4 conditions, I would prioritize looking at testing the first 2 conditions, whether the market is attractive and whether this would make financial sense for our client. And if these 2 are proven to be true, then I think we can then spend the remaining time understanding the capabilities and risk. So if the overall approach sounds reasonable to you, Abby, then what I'd like to do is just take another minute to articulate what are the kind of analyses that we need to test under the first and second condition.
Yes, please.
Okay, so I think under market attractiveness, I'm looking for 3 things. First, we want to understand if the market size, is it big? Is it a growing market? Like, do we expect to sell more buses in the US over the next 3 to 5 years? Second, we would also want to understand if our client would command a favorable position within the competitive landscape. We understand they're a current market leader, but we should look at the trends and see whether that remains to be true over the next 3 to 5 years. So how would the market shares of the other 2 players, how do they look like? Do we expect them to catch up over the next 3 to 5 years? The third thing I would test for is whether there's strong customer uptake for our target company's product. So our buses better than the other competitors' buses, maybe in terms of the number of seats they have, or maybe they are green buses. They run on electric power rather than gas. So this is what I would like to look at. And if we can prove that the market is attractive, then I'll move forward to the second bucket, which is to go into the financial analysis, right? We want to make sure that our client would actually be able to achieve its ROI. So specifically here, I'll be looking at whether the annual operating profits that we can generate from acquiring this bus company over the investment time frame of 3 to 5 years, as you mentioned earlier, would be larger or significantly larger than the investment cost or the acquisition cost of this company. If that can be proven to be true, then we will be confident that the client would be able to achieve this ROI. So I think we can check with the client for the acquisition cost, but here I'll focus on laying out how we can derive annual operating profits. So essentially, annual operating profits can be broken down into the profits from its B2B segment and the B2C segment, as you shared earlier. And under each of these segments, essentially, we want to break it down into its logical subcomponents, revenue and cost. So under revenues, we want to understand what are the number of buses that Big Yellow Bus Co. expects to sell going forward, and also at what realistic price point they can sell their buses at. And then on the cost side, we'd like to understand what the variable cost and the fixed cost would be. Here, I'll imagine that the variable cost and fixed costs could include things like fuel, bus drivers, and even just maintenance costs of the buses and cleaning costs of the buses. But essentially, once we are able to quantify all this, we would be able to check whether the annual operating profit is indeed large enough over the investment timeframe to hit the ROI. So this is how I intend to conduct the specific analysis for the first and second bucket. And if this makes sense to you, I'll be very happy to get started and to ask for information to allow us to do so.
Yeah, this makes sense. Could you just very quickly, I know you mentioned earlier you had 2 other buckets you would like to look at.
Yeah,
Could you
sure.
very quickly go over those as well?
Sure, very happy to do so. So assuming that the market is attractive and we can achieve financial viability, then we should check whether our client has the capabilities. And here there are 2 things: financial capability and operational capability. So financial capability meaning can they afford acquisition? And even if they can afford, how are they going to do it? Is it by cash? Is it by equity? Is it by debt? It's useful to understand how they're going to structure the affordability of this acquisition. Now, second, we should understand whether our client has the operational capability. So for example, have they had similar experiences acquiring bus companies in the US or maybe in other markets before? Do they know what it takes to run a profitable bus company? Do they have executives, perhaps maybe not in the bus companies, but from other companies like airline companies or transport companies, whereby they could bring experience, a knowledge of how to run a transport business to this target company, right? And if we are confident that they have the necessary capabilities to run the company, then we should also check whether they are aware of and whether they can mitigate and handle the kind of risks that may be associated. So let me give some flavor of some of the risks I mentioned earlier. One would be business risk. So for example, nowadays, we are in a situation whereby pandemics and viruses break out quite frequently. We want to understand if such a situation happens again, or such a outbreak happens again, would would transport of kids within a closed kind of environment like a school bus be affected? So would it affect our business demand? That's one. Second, we would like to understand also regulatory risk. So for example, we are talking about the transport of school children, and it's very normal for the regulatory authorities to typically add more regulations to ensure safe transport. This could either mean increase in cost for us, or it could mean a disruption to the way we operate our business model. So we want to make sure that those risks are understood well and can be mitigated if they happen. And the third category of risk would be operational risk. So for example, how are we going to find the necessary amount of bus drivers sorry, let me take a step back. How are we able to find the number of workers that would be able to manufacture such buses for Big Yellow Bus Co? Because I would assume that such an industry, a lot of the workers could be on lower wages, and there could be an issue of getting perhaps foreign labor from outside the US to work in such factories. And if that's the case, then there's a question about quota, there's a question about whether they have the necessary skill set to manufacture to a safety level required by US standards. So these are some possible risks. Happy to go into more if the client requires, but I just wanted to at least lay out some of the thinking behind capabilities and risks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we're good for now with those points of consideration. Those are quite comprehensive. So like you said, market attractiveness is definitely the first thing we want to look at. And as part of that, as you mentioned, is the size of the market. So our client is interested to see how large is the market for school buses in the US in general. And let's disregard whether it's B2C or B2B.
Okay.
So they'll just focus on the overall demand side. And the second question they want to ask you is, how attractive is the market? And to answer the second question, we got a bit more data. So we know that Big Yellow Bus's prices are about 20% higher than its competitors.
20%?
20%, yes.
Okay.
We know that the market has a fairly steady long-term 3% growth rate driven by GDP and population growth. However, the market growth has been 6% over the past 2 years as local towns rush to buy buses prior to new emissions regulations coming into place. And again, let's just focus on the US market, and customers are almost exclusively the local cities and towns in the US.
Okay, clear. Okay, so just to be clear, there are two questions here. The first one is to size the number of school buses that could be sold in the US on a per year basis. Okay, and then the second question sounds like we will be adding on the, when we try to figure out how attractive it is, we are trying to add on or figure out what the total revenue of that market is. Is that right? Like factoring in price. So
no need to actually calculate for the second question because you currently don't have the price information. So let's just assess at a fairly high level. You don't really need to do math if you think this is an attractive market, given the information you're given.
Okay, I see. All right. So I think if you're okay, let's focus on the first question first, and then let's move on to the second one. All right. Okay, so the question is how many school buses can be sold in the US market in a year, right? Okay. So what I'm going to do, Abby, is let me just take a moment to think through what the mathematical word equation, what a reasonable one may look like. And I'll come back to align with you on the logic first before we plug in numbers to calculate. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah. All right. So to get to the number of school buses that can be sold each year, this is what I have in mind. We can start from the number of schools in the US as a start. And then from there, we could then factor in the number of students or average number of students per each of these schools to understand the total student population across the whole of US schools. And then factoring in a percentage of students that actually require bus as a transport to go to schools. Because some people may, depending on where they stay, they could walk to school if it's nearby or parents drop them off. There'll be a percentage that would require a school bus. So we factor that in. And once we have that, then we could divide by the capacity of the bus. So like to figure out, if a bus can take 20-seater or 40-seater, then the number of buses that we need. And this would then give us a sense of the number of buses that we need across all schools in the US at any point in time. But we should also factor in the fact that what is the renewal rate or the life cycle of each bus, right? So if buses can run for say 10 years or 15 years, which means every 1 out of 10 years or every 1 out of 15 years, the companies or there'll be demand to buy new buses from big bus, yellow bus company. So I think this is my way of thinking. I just happy to kind of refine it further with you first before we work on the numbers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much for putting thoughts into this and for aligning with me before running any calculations. So I hear where you're coming from with your approach. With regards to the first thing you said about you want to start with number of schools in the US, how do you plan to estimate that?
We'll be right back after this quick break.
Have you ever heard a new digital trend and thought to yourself, okay, does this really matter? Asking the right questions helps you cut through the noise and get down to what matters most. I'm Jim Hertzfeld, host of the What If, So What podcast, where we discover what's possible with digital and figure out how to make it real by asking what if, so what, and most importantly, now what? Subscribe and listen, and together we can turn big ideas into tangible actions so you can get shit done.
Good question. I was actually about to ask if we have data on that, but if we have to estimate that, let me think about it really quickly. Well, I think that we could do one way is to perhaps maybe first define when we talk about schools, what kind of schools we're talking about, because there could be schools from elementary school to middle school, high school, and the structures of those could really be different. Is there a need to segment into that level of detail in this particular case?
So yeah, that would be one way to do it. Unfortunately, we don't have any information on the number of schools or overall or schools by segment. So instead of
Right.
that, why don't we approach this top down from the overall population and feel free to
Okay.
make assumptions around that.
Okay, sure. Sure. I think that's a good steer. Thanks for that. So one way we can do is to look at, like you said, overall population, segment them into reasonable age groups, and then focus on the age groups where we expect kids to go to school, right? So
Yep.
probably around, I don't know, 7 years old, 6 years old to, let's say, high school be up to 16, 17 or around there. And then based on that, that size of the number of students, we can then make an assumption of how many of them actually go to school, right? For a developed country like the US, on average, I expect it to be quite high, maybe above 80, 85 or 90%. And once we have that already, then we can also make an assumption as to the capacity of each school in terms of how many average number of students they have. And then that will give us a kind of a very top-down, high-level estimate of the number of schools in the US.
Yeah, that overall sounds great. Just to simplify it, let's disregard capacity of school, just to simplify the process a little bit. But other than that, it sounds great.
Okay, so then let me go ahead and get started to plug in the numbers, and I'll walk you through. So let's start with the number of population in the US. Would 300 million be a rough good estimate to go with, the overall population?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, clear. So what I'm going to do next is then segment the population, right? And I'm going to segment it into roughly four equal age groups. So 0 to 20, 21 to 40 years old, 41 to 60, and 61 to 80. I know that the average life expectancy could be slightly above 80 years old, but for the purpose of, I guess, just doing a...
Yeah.
80 is good, yeah.
Yeah.
So if we have kind of 4 age groups, then the question is now to scope down to where this school-going age would be. So I mentioned earlier about 7 to 17 years old. Would that be so about a 10-year period? Would that be
good.
fair? Yeah. Okay. Okay, very good. So then essentially what I would do is I would take 300 million total population. So if I would divide it by 4 into each of the age groups, that would be about 75 million per age group of a 20-year period. And we said that we aligned that the school-going age is about 10 years. So that'd be half of the 75 million, which means roughly about 37.5 million kids in the US are of school-going age. Now let's make an assumption about how many of them actually are enrolled and go to school. So I'm thinking probably something around 90%. Would that be a fair representation in the US?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. So let's take 90% of 37.5 million. So that's roughly, just give me a moment. Okay, so that's roughly 33.75 million. If you're okay, we can round it to 34 million children. So now we have this number, 34 million children actually go to school in the US. I know you said earlier that we can disregard the capacity of the school. So given this, and going back to my original structure, then if we know that 34 million children go to school, then what I would like to do next is to understand how many of these 34 million would actually require bus as a form of transport to the school. I'm not too familiar about the picture in the US. So if you have some information that can help us approximate that, that would be quite helpful.
Yeah, let's assume it's about a third.
About a third? Okay, so roughly about 11 million then, with some rounding, about 11 million out of 34 million go take bus, right? So now that we have this is really helpful. Then what we need to do next is to then factor in the capacity of each bus. What would the capacity be for each bus that Big Yellow Bus Co produces?
Yeah, let's assume it's about 50 children per bus.
50? Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do is to take 11 million divided by 50 to figure out how many buses are actually needed at any point in time. Just be a moment. Okay, so it looks like if I take 11 million kids divided by 50, then we need 220,000 buses at any point in time in the US. Now, given we're trying to size the annual market size of how many buses can be sold, nobody would be buying 220,000 buses every year because the buses have a certain shelf life. So we need to factor in what the shelf life is. I know in most places it's about anywhere between 10 to 20 years. I just want to know if our client has a specific number we can use.
Yeah, let's assume the average life of a bus is 10 years.
10 years? Okay, clear. Then if we work on that, then it means on average, every year, 22,000 buses need to be replaced or need to be bought again. So I think this would be the answer to the first question. The annual size of the school bus market is about 22,000 buses.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay, great. Right. So now that we have that, what we want to understand as other than the size is actually from the, if you consider some form of high level price numbers, whether this would actually be an attractive market to enter. So let me just quickly align with you on the information you gave earlier. You mentioned that the average price of our target company's bus is 20% higher than competitors, right?
Yes.
Okay. And you mentioned something else about the long-term growth rate of 3% by GDP and population. Can I clarify if this long-term growth rate is applied to the year-on-year growth in the price of the target company's buses?
So not necessarily on the price, it's just on the overall size of the market.
I see, size of the market, the school bus market. Okay, clear. All right. And then you mentioned the other data point, which was you said market growth has been 6% over the past few years. Okay, so if I put the 2 and 2 together, we are basically looking at a bit of a slowdown in the growth, right? From 6% to 3% going forward.
Or you could say that on average, it's been a 3% year-over-year growth, but over the past 2 years, actually, it's been an increase.
There could have been a faster rate in the past years. Okay, clear. All right. Okay, and can I just confirm, were this the only quantitative information that you provided earlier? I just want to make sure I didn't miss out anything else.
Yeah, this is all the information I provided.
Okay, very clear. So I think based on this information, and if we were to consider the information you gave at the start of the prompt as well, well, we know that the target firm commands a leading position in the market by revenue, and number 2 by volume. So given that kind of a baseline position and the market trends going forward, they would still command a higher price than the competitors of up to 20%. That looks quite attractive from a kind of a pricing standpoint. And then if we were to look at the long-term growth rate of the market on an average rate of 3%, that seems pretty healthy as well. I guess the only question that I have to confirm whether the market will be attractive would be to understand how our clients' market share is expected to change vis-a-vis the other competitors in the next few years. Because you mentioned that they were a clear leader 5 years ago. So I'm interested to know what the situation is now and whether perhaps they are at a king or at a point whereby things are changing. Do we know what's happening about them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we got a little bit more information from the client. So in a moment, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share with you an exhibit on the competitive landscape, and would like for you to tell us what insights you get from this exhibit.
Sure. All right. Let me just take a look at this exhibit. Okay, let me just take a moment to go through the details and I'll come back to you with the insights that you asked for. Yeah. Okay, this is really interesting. If I were to look at the market share analysis information, I think it corroborates with what you said earlier. We are number 1 in terms of market share by revenue, number 2 in terms of units. But what would be interesting for me actually is how this would change moving forward. The market share positions. And I think we can get a bit of a clue, or we can form some hypothesis based on the margin analysis information. Here I see that we actually have relatively the lowest gross margin and operating margins compared to the other 2 competitors. So a possible hypothesis is that, our cost base could be large, but the question for me is what is the implication of that? it looks like given a wider gross margin or operating margin, there is the strategic concern that the other competitors could be able to price or have more space to price their bus product cheaper than our target company, which also means that there is a threat of them gaining more market share by selling cheaper buses, which would steal market share away from Big Yellow Bus Co. over time. And if that turns out to be true, then it may erode the fact that we are able to price 20% higher than competitors A and B because our volume may be decreasing. So I think that is something that a hypothesis that I'd like to verify and understand. And if that's the case, then we will have to recognize that threat in our financial analysis over the next 3 to 5 years to really determine whether this makes financial sense for us to acquire a Big Yellow Bus company.
Yeah, that's a great hypothesis. So we took your insight back to the client, and the clients told us that, yes, they have been pricing their bus at a higher price point because they tend to have higher procurement costs compared to their competition. And unfortunately, the bus market is fairly commoditized. And so our client has been, or Big Yellow Bus has been losing market share because they've been commanding a higher price.
Right. No, I think that's really very important information. And given that, I think the key thing here is that given it's commoditized market, then price matters to the end customers. And so I think in terms of the next step that I would like to analyze, it will be this. Is there a way for us to be more price competitive by fixing the high procurement costs that we are facing with Big Yellow Bus Company? If there is scope for us to do that, then there's a chance for us to be price competitive, and then we may avert the situation whereby we lose market share. But if that turns out to be unfeasible to reduce procurement costs, then from the face of it, it does look like the market may not look attractive going forward in the next 3 to 5 years for our client. So as a next step, if it's helpful, we could look at whether there's opportunities for cost takeout in the procurement side of Big Yellow Bus Company.
Got it. Thank you so much. So based on everything we've done thus far, what would you like to advise our private equity firm on? Would you recommend that they go ahead with investing in Big Yellow Bus? Why or why not?
Sure. Let me just put it all really quickly together for the private equity company.
We'll be right back after this quick break. Every Tuesday at 12 p.m. Eastern, we run an extreme consulting makeover. What is this? Well, it's a live 1-hour Q&A session where we workshop 2 consulting candidates' resumes and we answer your questions live. Click the link in this episode's show notes to register for an upcoming extreme consulting makeover and to apply to have your resume workshop in front of a live audience. We'll see you next Tuesday.
All right. So, dear Mr. CEO of the private equity firm, you asked whether your company should invest and acquire Big Yellow Bus Company. Now, based on our analysis so far, our recommendation is no, and it's for this reason that the projections show that the Big Yellow Bus Company is very likely to lose market share to its 2 competitors over the next 3 to 5 year time frame that we are interested in. And this is due to the fact that the high procurement costs on their end has caused them to price higher than the competitors in what is actually a very commoditized market. Now, therefore, in terms of the next steps, we suggest 2 further analysis. 1, we should understand if there is scope for Big Yellow Bus Company to bring down its procurement costs, perhaps through renegotiating with our end suppliers. And if that's the case, then the second thing we can do is to conduct a financial viability or financial projections as to how the annual operating profits may look like over the next 3 to 5 years and whether it makes sense for us to enter. I'm very happy to work with your team on this when we resume work next Monday. Thank you.
Thank you so much, YC.
Thank you, Abby.
Yeah. For the sake of time, I'm just going to go straight into the feedback portion.
Sure.
Does that sound good? Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you so much for taking this on. Definitely takes a lot of courage to run a live case in front of everyone. So congrats again for doing that. Overall, I think clearly you're very solid, very strong candidate with a lot of practice in case interview. And so I'll try to be a little bit more nitpicky about my feedback if you're good with that, just to help you stand out from the pool of candidates. So yeah, again, great performance. So on the constructive feedback side, I would say the largest areas for improvement probably more around communications as well as time. And so if there are ways for you to condense and make your language more concise, which is linked with the time, because the case did take a little bit longer than we had hoped. And we can dive more deeply into the specific parts and figuring out tactical ways for you to shorten the time. So first of all, go into framework. Very solid framework and substantially. I think your content was really good. The buckets cover pretty much everything we would like to see in a framework for a PE investing kind of case. So I think the constructive feedback there is really around the time portion. I think framework typically, I would say, definitely takes less than 10 minutes, usually around 5 minutes or so. And I think this portion took longer than 10 minutes. So tactical ways to suggest for you to improve on that. One, I would say when you're giving the overview, let's just give the overview of the buckets. When you're giving the overview of the four dimensions, 4 buckets that you're going to dive more deeply in, you're already giving me some of the specific bullet points. And so that would have been one way to save time. In addition, I think you had taken this hypothesis of diving more deeply in the first 2 buckets, but not really elaborating on the last 2 buckets. I would say, actually, unless the interviewer is pushing you proactively to just focus on the first 2, let's try to give a little bit of time on each of the 4 buckets. And then if they push you, then you can dive more deeply. And so I think you, for example, on the second bucket around ROI, you spent an extraordinarily amount of time talking about, for example, the operating profit and how you can look at, the revenue and cost side. That's great analysis, but I think it is a little bit too deep for the sake of the purpose of the framework portion, and also for the sake of time. So that would have been another tactical place where if you had been more concise and you didn't have to go as much in detail in order to save time.
Clear.
Yep. Great. And then on the market sizing portion, love how you took the time, thought about the approach before you plugged in any numbers. That's definitely the right thing to do, right? For example, in this case, because I did have to nudge you in slightly adjusting your approach, it was great that you didn't go into any of the math. Otherwise, you would have wasted time. So great job on that. And great to see that, you're very open-minded. You're open to steering, but also not just doing it blindly. So you really thought about it when I asked you, how would you estimate the number of schools? And when you realized it was going to be more challenging and we didn't really have data to help you out on that front, then you're more open to being steered. So I think one tactical constructive feedback on market sizing is when you looked into the age segments, it would have been because essentially you're just assuming a linear spread across each age segment, right? So if you had decided, you're looking at a 10-year span, it's really just 10 over 80 years, right? So it would have been 12.5% instead of first splitting the population into segments of 20 years and then having that. So that would have been a little bit faster as well.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. But overall, the math was flawless. You did math solidly and quickly. So overall, great job on market sizing. Yeah. And then on the exhibit. So again, great job because this exhibit had a little bit more information than the average exhibit. So it was great for you to ask for time, digest it, and then come back with just the insights. So great job on that. I would say the insight you gave was good. You tried to compare the exhibit with all of the information and the data you haven't given before and see if things matched and try to draw the insights from that. One thing was I wish you had proactively told me about, your hypothesis being big yellow bus would have higher procurement cost. I was the one, so you pointed out how we're higher in price and we'll have a lower profit margin. But the next level in that analysis would have been, okay, why? Why is that if we're charging more, but we're actually not as profitable? Then the next level hypothesis would have been, okay, perhaps we have higher procurement cost.
Yeah.
And so I had to kind of give that information for you. So you're scratching the surface, but it would have been stronger if you had given me that hypothesis proactively.
Right. Okay, makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And then final recommendation was great. Love the structure. The timing on that was great. So overall, very solid performance for sure. And so I would say just working on condensing that communications and make the language a little bit more precise. Thank you so
Great.
much.
Thank you so much for the feedback. Really helpful. And I hope it's helpful for the other listeners on this live stream as well.
Abi would love to work with you to develop a personalized case prep plan. Learn more about Abi and book a one-on-one session with her today at the link in this episode's show notes. If you enjoyed this live case, please let us know by leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We really appreciate it, and it helps get the word out to more people that this show is worth listening to. Thank you for being a loyal listener. We'll catch you again on another episode in a few days.